This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Lately, as I've been browsing the internet, I have noticed a strange movement is forming.
Ugly, depressing, a cross between a
and
giant
rise of modernist architecture has dramatically impacted the way American
This has
structures
led to a
are
lot of
designed.
buildings trying to be unique, but failing at being beautiful.
These videos get millions and millions of views, and it seems like the central theme is this hatred for modern architecture and modern cities. And throughout all of these videos, there is one name that just repeatedly comes up, and that is
Le Corbusier.
Le Corbusier.
Le Corbusier.
Le Corbusier.
There are many people that revere him as a genius, and many more people who absolutely hate him. Today, we will explore the complicated life of Le Corbusier.
As much a man who wanted to design buildings as one who wanted absolute power.
Okay, so Le Corbusier, it's not his real name. It's a dope alias. His real name is Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, and he was born on the 6th of October, 1887. Charles was the second son, aka the shit boy. The first son being Albert. Albert, he was the golden boy. His mum, his dad loved him. They thought this boy's gonna change the world, and they didn't really look at Charles in a very good light. Mother, may I have some dinner, please? Charles, quiet. Can't you see Albert is playing the violin now? Unlike Albert, he was shit in school and pretty much everything he did, other than drawing. In school, Charles had one teacher who was really key in his life, and that was Charles Laplantier. And very quickly, he noticed something in little Charlie. He saw a very rational mind, and so it would be him who would point Charles in the direction of architecture. And so age 17, Charles signs up to an architecture course, and in the first year, by the age of 18, he was working on a house for his teacher's mate. Bish bash bosh, next thing you know, Villa Fallet is born. The building was all right. I guess it was good. It's not bad. It's not bad. Is it the work of a genius? I don't know if that's for me to say. However, little Charlie deducted it was the work of a genius. And so he drops out of school. He leaves, he goes, all right, see you later, lads. I'm off to become one of the greatest architects of all time. I'll catch you in a bit, all right? And he departs on a world tour. Young Charles, in 1907, packs his bags to go travel around the world and just look at buildings. This is really interesting to note because originally, Charles loved traditional architecture. He loved it. He revered it. He literally would study and draw every single aspect of these ancient, beautiful buildings. On top of that, he would read these architectural books and learn more about them. But what's very important is to note that he never had traditional training as an architect. He just went off his own observations. He never received a qualification. He was never officially an architect. Charles came across Nietzsche's works, like his books, the philosophy. I'm not going to pretend I fucking understand Nietzsche, but one of the characters in his book was called the Creator. And it was said that the Creator basically took these tablets that had the old laws on it and smashed them, aka out of the old and in with the new. This was music to Charlie Boy's ears. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. They are the #1 platform for building your own beautiful, gorgeous website. Now with their new guided design system, you can have your own completely personalized website where you can choose from a professionally created layout and choose some different styling options, and it'll give you a completely customized and unique design to fit exactly what you do. And now with the optimized SEO tools, you're going to appear higher in search results, which will help you to grow. And they're super flexible when it comes to payments. They got Apple Pay, PayPal, many others. And in certain countries, you can even do buy now, pay later using Afterpay and ClearPay. And they've even got Squarespace AI. So you can just whack in a prompt about what it is, maybe a product description, and it will shoot out some really good copyright, and you can just go and tweak that to how you want it to be. All of this will allow you to focus on making the product really good, and Squarespace will just take care of the rest. So be sure to head over to squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant, and to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. And so Charles, now with his head filled with these new sexy ideas, he finishes his world tour and he returns back to his small hometown in Switzerland. And he sets up his own architectural practice with one person on the world that he really wants to impress. In 1912, Charles gets to work on his most grand project ever, a new home for his parents. And so this family, this is a frugal family, they're very reserved, they don't make much celebration about themselves. What does Charles build them? A fucking mansion. He gave them this enormous kitchen as if they were gonna host dinner parties. For who? I don't know. His mum saw the building and said, Charles, What the fuck have you done? Within 10 years, the family had to move out of the house because the house cost them so much, it bankrupted them. That aside, if we look at his first buildings, his first homes, we'll notice they're built in a very traditional style. However, we do start to see in some of his early works this what would go on to be very definitive style of very bold shapes. You see, Charlie was very creative. You cannot deny it. He'd been thinking about new ways of building buildings. And it all came down to his discovery of this one weird material, reinforced concrete. All right, boys, I'm about to do a whole section talking about concrete. I promise you it's interesting. Just stick with me here. In December 1914, Charles had actually started to do a study on the uses of reinforced concrete in buildings. And it's because reinforced concrete does something very different. Like, there's a reason that you don't see Dubai's Museum of the Future in 15th century Italy. And it's not because they actually had taste. It was because it wasn't possible. Concrete has been used for a long time. The Romans even used concrete. You can even see it in the Pantheon, which is the oldest building on Earth. But you see, this concrete, it wasn't that practical. There's a whole video by the Aesthetic City on it. I'll link that below. But basically, concrete is only strong if you place it under tension. You know, it just needs a little hug. And so what that meant is traditionally, when you wanted to use concrete, you would have to build things like arches. Through just the forces of nature, this would apply tension to it, making it strong. However, there is a hack. There's a way to get around this flaw. Basically, you just got to ram some metal rods in it. And basically, the metal rods are like a trampoline. They stretch and bend, and you can now use concrete in ways completely unimaginable in traditional architecture. And so, Charles, the boy who saw himself as the creator, the smasher of tradition, Charles saw what reinforced concrete could offer him, leading him to creating this game-changing design, the Domino House.
The domino is really more of a diagram than a building. You can see it's really a superstructure. Le Corbusier called it a chassis onto which any number of variations of houses could be outfitted.
Well, I know what you're thinking. What the fuck is that? How is that impressive? But I'll be honest, as much as I will go on to criticize Le Corbusier, this is sick. I promise you. Before the Domino House, you would have buildings with walls. I don't know if you didn't know that. If you didn't know that, I don't know how you got to this video. That feels like you have lots of things you need to learn in life. The walls had to be carefully placed and managed so they could take the load of the building. And this would heavily dictate how you could make a building. It couldn't go outside of certain parameters, or it would just crumble and kill everyone inside. But you see, the Domino House showed the power of reinforced concrete. It was basically like the bare minimum structure of how you could build a house now, whereby you could have these concrete pillars and slabs, and that was all you needed to hold up the building. This is like the minimal. This gave architects complete freedom and also repeatability. These could just be stacked together and it would work. And so with this new concept, Charles was looking around at his little town and he realized, I'm way too big of a fish for this place. That, and also his architecture practice was failing in this town, but you know, it's not that, it's because I'm a genius. And so Charles grew to hate his hometown. He states that my ambition, vanity, and pride is pushing me towards great works. And so, at the age of 30, in 1917, Charles would arrive in what would become his new home, the center of art and culture in Europe, Paris.
In Paris, too, they're fed up with the war. They, too, are tired. It is boring because it never changes. No brilliant news.
Charles picked a pretty weird time to move to Paris. It was in the middle of World War I. You got bombs, bullets, and bullshit whizzing around your head, but he didn't mind. He actually liked this. He felt that there was a buzz to war that kind of got him going a bit. Charles was looking around and seeing history play out in front of him. He was seeing all of Paris radically changing, and Charles wanted to be a part of that change. And so, Charles sets up another architectural practice. He wants to capitalize off of the rebuilding of this city after the war. And yet again, that was a failure. And so, depressed, sad, and lonely, Charles headed to where all sorry men of the past went, the brothel. Charles got pretty stuck into the underworld of Paris, and that just also happened to be where all the cool artists frequented. And slowly he would attend these events, if you want to call them that, and he would start to rub shoulders with the artistic elite of Paris. And so eventually Charles would meet a very important cubist painter called Amédée aux Enfants. These two cheeky chaps were instant besties, and aux Enfants would show him the new way, the purest style of painting. And Charles took a real interest into geometric shapes. The pair joined forces and created a magazine called L'Esprit Nouveau. This magazine was a success. It attracted all the top artists at the time. But what was interesting is that the most popular articles in the magazine weren't about art, but instead they were about architecture. These articles would show these crazy radical approaches to architecture, and each of them would be signed off with the name Le Corbusier.
Le Corbusier was born. He was the character that Charles Edouard created for himself in 1920. Round black shell glasses, severe suit and bow tie. A dress code that would never change.
Everything about him was meticulously calculated. He would even write to his mum in his frequent "Hey, look at me, mum, I'm not useless" updates, where he would refer to Le Corbusier in the third person. He describes Le Corbusier as an entity released from the burden of flesh. You know, just the type of thing artists say. But you see, due to Le Corbusier's self-taught nature, he had a total freedom from the rules of architecture. And it led him to explore and develop a style that was radically different from the past. It's really important to note when we look at his style, we have to think about how it was a response to the 1900s, the early 1900s, and how history was up until that point. The industrial era, which we talk endlessly about, was a revolution in just about fucking everything. We could talk endlessly, but there's one really good example here, and it was like Le Corbusier's favorite thing, the Ford T. Thanks to modern machinery and factories, etc., America were able to churn out these Ford T cars very quickly and perfectly. But there was one industry that hadn't really caught up to the modern world.
Oh dear. Oh god. Oh, no. Okay.
Building up until this point was just local fucking Barry the bricklayer carting over a horse load of bricks and building a house whilst taking smoke breaks, etc. And there was nothing that pissed off Le Corbusier more than this. Le Corbusier believed that Barry should be no more, and we should be able to click a button and a house would pop out. But you see, that is the technical side of Le Corbusier's approach to architecture, but that's only part of what drove him. Arguably, the most important part of Le Corbusier was his ideology.
How does a continent at war for 6 years and unstable for much longer create peace when so many national, ideological, and social resentments remain?
Politically, post-World War I and II, the world was in a very interesting place. In this time, we were seeing the rise of very new attitudes to running the world. We had socialism, communism, fascism, all of which wanted to completely change the way that we structured society. Previously, we had these very unequal societies of extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people. Some of that wealth could be described as shady, like colonizing entire nations and selling slaves, and then even back here just paying people nothing and letting them live in squalor whilst taking all this money and creating these outrageously ornate and beautiful buildings, pretty much as a way to just display their wealth to the world. I'm really trying to get into the mind of Le Corbusier and the entire modernist movement of that era. So let's just imagine taking a stroll down a road in Paris. It's 1918, you walk past these beautifully ornate buildings, and then not a few meters away you go down a side street and it's just hell. It's like disease, piss, poo, poor people, you know, all of that stuff. And when the world went to war twice, who do you think was sent to that war? Was it the people in the nice buildings or the shit buildings? Shock horror, it was the people in the shit buildings. So all these working class people were sent off to go die in wars that required insane amounts of resource and money to be pumped into the war that was destroying Europe. All of this happening under the direction of the people living in the really nice buildings. So do you see where I'm coming from? This is a period of time of very revolutionary thought. And so let's be completely fair. In this era, someone like Le Corbusier makes sense. And I'm really just using Le Corbusier as a face of the entire modernist movement that came from here. This movement spans across many different art forms and artists and different architects, etc. It's a big movement. And so when all of these people looked at these buildings that we can sit here now and look at as beautiful, for them, it gave them a feeling of disgust as to what they represented in that era. But you see, there was one man who could save everything. One man who could rewrite the wrongs of the past. And that was your boy Corbs. Le Corbusier. Sorry, I'm just being fun. The modernists. These were them architectural bad boys, the rule breakers, the troublemakers, the booty shakers, the takers. You know, they saw something different than just grubby shit pits and beautiful palaces. They believed that buildings should be fundamentally functional. Because as we looked around the rest of the world and we were seeing how modern machines were doing this process in many other things, Le Corbusier deducted that the house was a machine for living. So Le Corbusier and his elite technocratic tendencies led to the creation of Siam. This was like the holy council of the top architects of the time. And they had a very clear objective. They wanted to standardize the entire building industry, to create practices that could be done universally all around the world and repeated. Up until now, every different country, different towns had different ways of building. They would use local materials with local craftsmen who only knew how to work with them because his dad taught him and his dad's dad taught him and his dad's dad taught him as well. You know, it was beautiful, it was romantic, but this is the modern world now, Barry, and fucking romance ain't gonna get you anywhere, you little flirt. So now let's consider the influence of these communist and fascist ideas of the time, where both ideologies wanted to create new civilizations that would answer the problems of the modern world. And one of, if not the most key problem, was housing for the working class. The miracle of industrialization meant that things could be done at rapid speeds. However, in order for us to do that, everything needs to be exactly the same. No, Barbara, you can't have a pink house, it's a grey block for you. Something like Le Corbusier's Domino House was perfect, coincidentally, because it could be mass reproduced. The mass production and the universality meant that you could bring down labor costs and the cost of materials. And so Siam set out to do just that, to try and standardize the whole industry. And one of the standards they came up with was called the existence minimum, where it was said that because they wanted to take a scientific approach, they studied many different regions and reported back what is the minimum amount of space and facilities that your average working class person needs. And it would be the culmination of these new ideas and standards that would find itself in the Plan Voisin, or the Plan Voicing, as I'll probably end up referring to it as.
Le Corbusier came up with a supposed solution. He had designed a new city built for a modern man, and he took the ideals of that city and imagined a new Paris.
After making a handful of houses for very wealthy people, Le Corbusier decided now it was time for him to create entire worlds. And in the cupboard of Le Corbusier lies one skeleton, you could say, and that was that he kind of was a fascist. What really tickled his pickle about fascism was the top-down hierarchy. You know, an elite group that were really smart and knew everything and could decide every decision for everyone else. And so in 1922, Le Corbusier proposed to flatten very historic, very beautiful parts of Paris and make way for concrete skyscrapers. The skyscrapers, of course, would house the technocratic elite of this society. This whole plan was wrapped around these very efficient highways that at times would even go underneath the skyscrapers as the whole city was built on stilts. In Le Corbusier's mind, this was utopia. But as you can imagine, people hated this idea. But whilst the plan would fail, its core principles and its ideas would fundamentally change the future of city planning. In 1908, a famous lecture was given by Adolf Loos, where he preached that ornamentation was crime. This sentiment was echoed by Le Corbusier, where he said that modern decorative art has no decoration. And it seems like the most influential architects of this era listened to these two and said, yes, Le Corbusier, we completely 1,000,000% agree, and now all we're allowed to make is concrete blocks. Thanks. But you see, Le Corbusier's name was really gaining attention, and we would see Le Corbusier's fascistic tendencies sort of finding their home in the Siam meetings. And it would be in this one very important piece of work, the Athens Charter. This was like a document that kind of collated the ideas for the most functional city, like the perfect utopian city, and Corbusier would make what was called the Radiant City, or Ville Radieuse. Le Corbusier sold this plan as if it was like the unanimous agreement of the whole Siam conference. However, reality is, they had very different attitudes and definitely didn't agree. And so despite the fact that for a long time his plans were never succeeding, he was just making homes for very wealthy people, but his controversial radical thoughts had got his name out of there, mainly in a negative way. Lots of people hated him. But you see, amongst the artistic and architectural elite, Le Corbusier was loved and revered, leading him to going to America. 1935, Le Corbusier lands in America, and basically from here, his celebrity status would just explode. Like, the journalists would absolutely bum him. I don't know if they even understood what he was talking about, but they just assumed because he was French and had some glasses, he probably knows what he's talking about. And famously, he was asked to comment on America's skyscrapers. Now, bear in mind, America are quite proud of their skyscrapers. They thought they were quite cool. And Corbusier just says, nah, mate, they're not tall enough. And it got ridiculous. Corbusier's celebrity status became insane. He would do these lectures and there'd be a bit of paper in the back. He's scribbling all his bullshit on it. And women would literally rip off pieces of paper and fight for these pieces of paper so they could say that they came so close to touching Jesus's cloth. And so into the 30s, Corbusier continued to write and theorize about architecture, all the while not really actually building anything, just talking about it a lot. But then, the best thing in Le Corbusier's life would ever happen, World War II.
Germany's wild attack becomes more savage every hour. Down swoop their bombers on undefended towns, down upon women and children.
For most people, World War II was considered like the worst moment in human history, but for the modernists, this was payday, because they understood that World War II meant bombs. Bombs meant destruction, destruction meant needing to rebuild cities, and that meant we can make our fucking utopia. During this time, Corbusier would find himself in Vichy in France. And probably to Corbusier's delight, Vichy was under a fascist regime. They sided with the Nazis. And Corbusier kind of saw that if he went there, he might become the great architectural dictator of France. But it didn't really pan out like that, so he returned to Paris and he became a technical advisor to Dr. Alexis Carrel, who was the theoretician of eugenics. Yeah, I don't know if I can make many jokes about that. Corbusier worked for him for a bit and then decided that he didn't really like the vibe of the work atmosphere and quit. By the time the war came to an end, Corbusier was nearly in his 60s. Despite being like this globally celebrated genius, he hadn't had a single project come to life in 10 years, due to his radical proposals often being rejected. But finally, everything would change for Le Corbusier with his first mass housing project, Unité d'Habitation. And well, it looks like this. The building itself was, you know, it was something. It not only had sort of reasonably sized rooms with good access to lighting, the hallways were to work as like community street areas. It had shops, eating places, a nursery, recreational facilities. There was even a small stage up top on the roof where you could do like theatre performances, and a running track. The building was surrounded by trees, a small park. It was revolutionary. Ugly, but revolutionary.
Le Corbusier had made a major statement. At the start of the 1950s, people rushed to discover his utopian building. Even the great Pablo Picasso came to admire his masterpiece.
The Unité d'Habitation became a turning point in the career of Le Corbusier. In 1952, he was made the commander of the Légion d'Honneur in a ceremony that they actually hosted on the roof of that building. And more projects started going his way, and he would just take this building and just copy and paste it somewhere else. But regardless, he had gone from an outsider, a critic of the architectural world, to now the most prominent French architect. Le Corbusier's fame went beyond architecture, and he became one of like the most celebrated genius artists of this time. In 1947, he went on to create the United Nations headquarters. Working with these world leaders, he was now stepping himself closer and closer to his real dream, his dream of building entire worlds. And in 1950, Le Corbusier would land his most iconic project ever, the creation of Chandigarh.
It's also a hugely symbolic city in the history of modern India. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, commissioned Le Corbusier to design Chandigarh as what he called a new city, unfettered by the traditions of the past, a symbol of the nation's faith in the future.
On top of the fact that it looks like complete shit, it's said that despite the idea of like kind of trying to eliminate the strong class differences, it ended up just completely reinforcing them, whereby 2 to 4 of the poorer families might share one single house, and the privileged elite are in the private bungalows. But you see, it didn't matter because he had made it, he'd built his city, and whilst his name was now on the lips of all the most important people on planet Earth, there was still that one person whose approval he so desperately sought. And so he got to building a brand new home. This building was to be purely functional. No gimmicks, no bells and whistles, no room for dinner parties. He built this house for his mum to have a simple life. And as it would reveal in one of the letters he would write to his mum, he said,
"If you bothered to pay attention to the world around you, you would know that I have become one of the most famous architects in the world."
And his mum writes back, "Very good, my roof is still leaking." Le Corbusier would die at the age of 77, going for a swim in the Mediterranean Sea, as he'd retreated into a very frugal, modest way of living in his elderly age. However, the impact of Le Corbusier and the modernist movement has fundamentally changed the world. After World War II, the population exploded, and a lot of the Western world made a move to clear up the slums and to house the working class in better conditions than before. And we have to give them credit. The modernists and Le Corbusier, thanks to them, they were able to en masse house the working class in better conditions than they'd ever been before, massively improving the lives of many people. From the commie blocks in USSR to the brutalist council estates in Britain, the lives of the working class had improved. And it is vital that we recognise this, because ultimately that is the most important thing. No matter how fucking ugly and as aesthetically bankrupt as I think and you probably think these buildings are, they served an important purpose. However, modernism and its subsequent evolutions became almost a religion in the architectural world. Very rarely these days will you ever see buildings created in a traditional style. Modern architects will just throw the word pastiche at it and consider that a get out of jail free card. They decided that Le Corbusier onwards is all you can do in architects. That's it. It's just boxes or nothing. You can see it in articles like this where they criticize building in traditional styles. Trying to make this new building as non-threatening as possible by dressing it up in period costume strikes me as a fool's errand, and one that is frankly embarrassing. It's like statements like this where they try and over-intellectualize the fact that people don't like modern architecture, that their work is shit. And it's weird, it's like a strange dogmatism. And so we would see this era of what would be dubbed starchitects. These lone genius figures that need to impose their artistic vision on the world. And they have this attitude that every building needs to be some wacky, weird design and they need to reinvent the wheel each time. In the realms of painting and art, that's fine, because you can hide that in a contemporary art gallery that I don't need to visit and you guys can all pat yourselves on the back about. But these starchitects treat the public realm as if it's an art gallery, which it's not. But look, pretentious architects are only actually a small part of the problem. Mainly, the real problem comes down to development firms, the companies that build buildings and housing. As time passed, modernism and its lack of ornamentation and overall aesthetics became a really good tool for the development firms that turned housing into an investment opportunity. Because when it comes to building, if your goal is to up the profits, one of the things that if you want to maximize your profits that you can just cut out of the budget is aesthetic beauty, is architecture. Through the creation of universal mass housing methods, Siam, Le Corbusier, the modernists, they gave them a recipe to make prefabricated buildings. And so it's led to this thing where architects don't even really have much of a say. Their hands are kind of tied because they can just be cut out of the budget. And so many cities that were once beautiful have just seen themselves lose their character, lose their soul. And in the modern world where the internet has given more people a voice, it has led to what some people refer to as the architectural uprising. All across social media, you can see just people shitting on modern architecture. Some of the reels I've made have had millions of views, and it's just me saying how ugly a building is. Fuming. Bang. Look at this fucking thing. Oh my God, is it ugly. There's a very real hatred to this out there, and people want more from their cities. And it's not just online, it's actually led to architects, people like Leon Cryer, who makes very compelling arguments against modern architecture. He has created entire towns based on some of his principles. And all across Europe, there's been loads of revival restoration projects to try and rebuild beautiful buildings. In the early 1900s, the story of beautiful buildings and slums led people to concluding that beautiful architecture was evil and that ornamentation and beautiful design was unnecessary and wasteful. But we live nearly 100 years on from this, where a new narrative is being formed. Le Corbusier and Siam believed wholeheartedly in science-backed design, use research and data to create ideas on how to make buildings. But new scientific research has come out suggesting that, shock horror, people feel better when they live around beautiful buildings. You feel better, you're happier, you're prouder in your community. It's not only good for just the individual, but the collective, the whole group of people that live in these areas. And so in this modern world where we see the housing industry failing us by not only extorting us for money, but failing us in building beautiful cities that we can be proud of. Look, for me, I'm not one of those people that just believe everything in the past was better. There is definitely very good things that came from modernism. The ideas of like minimum dwelling standards so that everyone has equal access to light, green space, reasonable size housing, I'm all for that. I do think in their hearts they probably had some good intentions at some point, but I really think they just missed the mark by completely throwing away tradition. And I think what people want to see isn't a complete return to the past, but just taking some notes from traditional architecture. I don't know why that's so hard to do. That isn't saying that every building needs to look like Buckingham Palace, but I do think somewhere between Buckingham Palace and a glass cube, there is a middle ground. And unfortunately, it's not only just money and architectural taste that get in the way, but also building regulations. I read this article here that said that despite a massive demand for Georgian-style housing, our regulations in England make it nearly impossible to make it. This led Keir Starmer to actually calling for more Georgian houses, and it even led King Charles to creating an entire town to show that we can still build in classical styles. And so I hope one day these regulations are relaxed so that we can build beautiful buildings, build beautiful places that we can feel proud about, so that buildings can be more than just a machine for living. If you enjoyed that video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Join the Discord, we'll chat about this topic and much more. You can join me on my live streams. I'll link that below. Peace.